So we are almost ready to start. We wanted to thank Nesta and DCMS who've been supporting both editions of Fixfest UK. We are now in the second half of this 11 session long edition of Fixfest UK. And this evening we are talking about reuse, and it's an honor to have Felipe Fonseca joining us for this session. Felipe is a Brazilian activist and free open advocate turned researcher working on the Open Dot project, currently based in Dundee and Scotland. In the last 15 years, he's been a co-founder and leader of a number of community and networking initiatives dedicated to critical thinking and making at the crossroad between culture, science, technology, and society. And we are especially fond of his meta-recyclagem project. And he was writing about some topics very dear to us at a time when very few people were caring. So without any further ado, I'll leave the floor to Felipe. And I just want to remind you what we put in the chat, that we are also collecting notes from the session in the Etherpad, that the link is in the chat. And we encourage everyone to participate in this collaborative note-taking. Thank you, and thanks, Felipe.
Thank you, Hugo. Yeah, I'm very happy to be part of Fixfest. I was planning to go to Glasgow for the original plan, but unfortunately the world is changing a lot. Let me just open my presentation here. So yeah, maybe I should start. Can you move please to the next slide? So just a few information about what I'm doing today. I'll be talking for 5 to 7 minutes in 5 different topics. The idea is to have this progression about what I'm doing and some things that may be of interest to the restart and to the repair community. And after each of these parts, I'll make short breaks for discussions and comments or clarifications. And I think it's really possible that we run out of time for deeper discussions, but that was not the plan for today. I'm open to catch up at any time. It's easy to find me in social networks, and everybody has my contacts in the Restart community. And I'm at the Restarters Forum website. So yeah, please just drop a line if you want to discuss anything further. Next slide, please, Hugo. So the first part is this brief introduction about who I am and what I'm doing right now. So again, for the next slide, I'm one of the fellows of the Open Dot project. It is a research project funded by Horizon 2020 about smart cities, about Internet of Things, trust, policy making. And it is a cooperation between British University and the Mozilla Foundation. Mozilla is well known for being the maintainer and creator and maintainer of the Firefox browser, but it has many other projects. It is deeply involved with internet health, and they, along with the University of Dundee, started this PhD program that will last for another 2 years. It started last year, and myself and other 4 researchers from outside of the UK moved to Dundee to spend 1 year here, and then we'll be working with Mozilla in Berlin for another 18 months. And the final semester we'll be working on our thesis, and crazy about that. But then if you can move to the next slide, please, Hugo. So currently I am still based in Dundee. I was supposed to move to Berlin next week on the 1st of July, but because of COVID-19 and lockdown and restrictions, and specifically the uncertainties of getting a visa, we will be postponing to September. I'm also besides being a PhD candidate, I'm also an early stage researcher. Currently, I am located in the Northumbria University in Newcastle, even though I'm still living in Dundee. And for the last, I would say, 18 years, I was involved with many projects. The most relevant for this discussion, as Hugo was mentioning, was meta-recyclaging. I guess these images are familiar to many of you, you know, getting a screwdriver, opening things and trying to get them repaired. We had this project in Brazil that would set up computer repair labs or computer repair workshops in different parts of Brazil. Brazil is a very large country, about the size of Western Europe. And we had the chance to learn a lot about technologies, about people, about income generation, about culture by working in this project. It eventually got to have, at the same time, I guess, 12 labs, you know, permanent labs in different parts of Brazil, but we managed also to influence and to advise on policies about digital culture, about e-waste management legislations, and all sorts of issues related to technology and inclusion. The meta-recyclaging project, Hugo, can you move to the next slide, please? It lasted between 2003 and 2012, roughly. 2002 it was created, but then we had the first lab in 2003. And it was totally distributed. So each lab had their own particular partnerships and decision-making processes. And that was, I guess, one of its strengths. So we didn't have to rely on central coordination, but the things were totally different. And each lab had autonomy to make their own decisions. And then one more slide, please. We were able to advise also on legislation for e-waste management in Brazil. It used to be, it still is a huge problem, because Brazil by then was the country that was increasing the amount of waste, of electronic waste being produced every year. And until 2010, we didn't have proper legislation. It was being discussed for 19 years, not only electronics, but solid waste. There was not, you know, legislation in place. And then we were part of the movement that made sure that electronics, electrical and electronic equipment were included in the new legislation. And after that, there was still a lot of effort put into creating the regulation of the legislation, because it was not only about having a law that made sure that the responsibilities were attributed to the proper actors, but there was the need to create ways for these laws to put into action. And now things are, you know, not that good in Brazil, but at least some of those advances that we made since 2002, some of them are still in place, even though things have been changing. But yeah, I guess that's one part of it. If anyone has specific questions about that, I'd be happy to answer about meta-recyclaging, these first phases in Brazil. Otherwise, I'll just move on. Yeah, those are chopping boards. This was an experiment that we had an artist coming into one of the labs, and he was trying to create artworks. Actually, he spent some years with us. He used to create artworks with all sorts of discarded materials, and then he wanted to experiment with electronics. He made some experiments also with robotics and getting all sorts of donations that he got from the city waste collection service. So he would mix that with whatever he found in our lab. This lab specifically, on the right of this image, was in a very well-known place in São Paulo. that used to be the biggest jailhouse in Brazil. It's called Carandiru. And in 1991, there was a massacre. 111 inmates were killed by the police after a mutiny. And because of that, this place was deactivated. It was not a jailhouse anymore, and it was transformed into a cultural space for youth. And these guys in the state government invited members of Meta Reciclagem to set up a lab there and to develop, all sorts of experimental uses for electronics. And it was very, very productive and creative space for some years. Yeah, many starting places. Yeah, let's not go that much into Brazil. So Hugo, can you just move on? So I arrived in Dundee last year to research smart cities, and just to keep that out of discussion, I'm not particularly happy with that term. I don't buy most of what is being said and written about smart cities. If anyone has read anything I wrote in my blog or other places, will know that I'm openly critical about smart cities, the way it is depicted by the industry and by municipal governments. But the research topic was set in the Open Dot project before I came to the project, and I was when I asked whether I was allowed to have a critical take on it, I had a very warm, welcoming response. So I think it may be useful to discuss smart cities under a more critical lens than it is usually done in business, engineering, and public administration. So this image is an image search I did about smart cities. It may have been in October. I don't think it would have changed today. If you look into the images usually associated with smart cities, it's all this, futuristic, blue, seamless scenario. And it makes me wonder two things. One of them is, what kind of city are those people who are talking about smart cities think of? Because this is not my experience of what a city is. And the other that you may notice is that there's no sign of people in these images. And I guess that is telling of where these images and this context comes from. Hugo, can you move slide, please? So this is also in São Paulo. It's a very well-known image. This is not a collage. This is a real picture made from a helicopter. That, I guess, is very telling of the city as a place of contradictions, of potential conflict, of inequality. And if you get to analyze literature about smart cities, it is seldom addressed. Those kinds of issues are seldom addressed. So it's usually about, increasing the productivity of public services, but never about addressing inequality, conflict, contradictions. And you can extrapolate from that smart cities, the way they are usually depicted, are not meant to address people's needs, but are meant to address the needs of governments. And you should say, you can say that the needs of governments in that sense is to reduce costs and still look good. And the needs of IT vendors, usually large corporations, willing to charge an extra for services that they already provide. There is a lot being written and researched about it, trying to bring a critical perspective to the way smart cities are addressed. The discourse of smart cities is built. Just to name a few researchers and writers, Adam Greenfield and Ayana Datta, both of them are at the UCL. Francesca Bria, who used to run the IT department or the innovation and smart city department in Barcelona and now moved to Italy. She wrote a book with Evgeny Morozov discussing smart cities and alternatives to this kind of narrative that is brought from the industry. And all of them are either against, around, or beyond smart city initiatives. They bring specifically, most of them bring this kind of criticism to a vision of cities that must be saved by private for-profit corporations and that should replace democracy for free markets that are never really free, but yeah, let's not even go into that. So this is the context that I'm trying to situate my research into. So this kind of critical take about smart cities that shouldn't be only about bringing digitally regulated markets and outsourcing everything to private companies. Let's move one slide, please, Hugo. And coming from my background, this is the kind of issue that I'm trying to address. If you go to, again, literature about smart cities, it's usually about smart bins, which is, to say the least, it's a kind of very superficial use of technology. Smart bins usually understood as, sensor-equipped curbside bins that will let the local authority know when they are about to get filled up, so as to improve the efficiency of waste collection. And it's always about optimizing collection of waste, and can be either recycled or non-recyclable waste, that will then be taken to private corporations that will make money charging society or governments to get rid of the waste. And one of the things, I guess, that is important to note is that it's usually about making waste disappear as quickly as possible. And there is a lot to discuss about the potential wealth, the potential value of the materials. And in some specific cases in the literature about smart cities or waste in smart cities, waste is treated as a field of urban mining that is to be explored by the same corporations that get paid to get rid of it. And there is a lot to say about conflicts of interest there. So the companies who are meant to recycle or to get rid of waste, either incinerating or putting into landfills, are the same companies that are making a profit with the volume of waste. So they should not be the ones in charge of reducing waste. And that, I guess, should be one topic of discussion. I don't know if anyone has anything to comment on that. These are the comments here. Hugo, can you move on to the next slide? So before.
I see some questions. Yeah. There's a question from Claire.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any discussion within smart cities on how to reduce the waste in the first place?
No, but I guess you see where I'm, the path that I'm trying to take. What I found, and it's been some months in which I was trying to perform a kind of literature review of whatever was being said about waste in smart cities that had to do with reuse. And what I usually find is an acknowledgement that all current literature says that reducing and reusing and refuse, reduce, and reuse is way less impactful than recycling or incineration or landfills. So whenever people try to research that, they acknowledge that, but they don't address that as a valid research question, because everybody seems to be just willing to make new ways to sell technologies. UK sends plastics to Turkey to recycle, but we send too much. Yeah, and then there is the effect of the Chinese ban on imports of waste. There's a lot of transnational movement of waste that is gradually being more regulated. There's still a lot of abuse. My current working thesis title, I change that every week, but I guess one of the versions that I was not that uncomfortable with was towards the commons of post-consumer objects, post-consumption objects, or post-consumption matter. Yeah, but that changes every time I say it. Any other question? What she said? Okay. So yeah, moving on about waste and reuse. So there's this image, there's this kind of really well-known formulation about reducing and also refuse, reduce, reuse, and I would add also, you know, repair, repurpose, or create other meanings for things. And for my research, one specific thing that I want to understand is how to see discarded materials as potential wealth. And that has a relation to circular economy, which I'm also very critical of. I haven't done that today, but if you try to, you know, do an image search about circular economy, I guess the scenario would be, the kind of image that will show up is similar to the ones about IoT. Very few people, and when people are portrayed, they are only portrayed as consumers and not as active actors or active members of whatever is being done about circular economy. So that this is one of the things that I find critical about that. And the other is that the circular economy, the way it is being formulated in, you know, the reports by Ellen MacArthur Foundation, is mainly geared towards, I would say, ways to lessen the friction for industrial production to keep feeding off the discarded material. So it's about, in a sense, it's about feeding back the monster that created all sorts of problems with industrial production that we see every day. So this is not, I think there is a lot of useful research and useful actions being done in that space, and there are very well-intentioned people, but I tend to have a kind of this more critical perspective, and I don't want to be one more person helping to feed that monster. I would like to see to think of other possibilities for the materials that circulate in society. And if you move to the next slide, please, Hugo. This is actually an image I made some months ago here in Dundee. It's a very common image. I think everyone sees these things, unfortunately, on a daily basis. What I find most, I guess one of the saddest things about this image is that it's about 100 meters away from two organizations who receive donations of materials and either sell them for a very affordable price or give them away for people in need. And I didn't stopped to investigate whether these materials were thrown out by these organizations or by people who wanted to donate, and these materials ended up there because the organizations wouldn't accept them. So I don't know exactly the story of this, but what I see in this image is a lot of potential wealth. Even if these things, any of these things were not working, they could be repurposed somehow. This is, I like to believe that, and I'd like to create ways for this potential wealth to be used until the last drop of potential use. Some years ago, next slide please, Hugo, I started a kind of open investigation. It was not a research project. It was between two projects. I was still living in Brazil. I was living in a place by the Atlantic forest and trying to understand what were the possibilities for an alternative socioeconomic development. That the place that I was living in has more than 80% of its territory in natural reserves. And because of that, the city cannot receive industrial production. So what I was trying to investigate was ways to apply some of the possibilities of new technologies and of industrial production, but to that specific place. And the idea to reuse discarded materials came even strongly. So I started this open investigation, and in this sense, I try to create connections between traditional craft, repair, reuse, and customization of things and mending with collection of recyclable materials and proper recycling. And then the third, axis would be makers and maker spaces and digital making and digital fabrication. So I started to experiment and to create small projects here and there, and to do some workshops and courses. But what I was trying to understand, what were the possibilities of connecting the skills and the equipment and the technology and the kind of worldview of repairs people with local makers and local manufacturing and digital technologies. That brought me to this place. Was in actually these two images are in Qatar, in Doha, in which I worked with students from the master's degree in fine arts, actually the master in fine arts in product design, and I brought them to explore what kinds of traditional repair and making were there in the city, because they were only in contact with digital making and not with local repair. And then the next slide, I went to Nantes in France, where there is a kind of really interesting ecosystem of organizations working with circular economy. And they had a community repair shop in an organization that would open every week for people just to show up there and bring their things to repair. And some volunteers would show up to help them. And it is akin to repair cafes everywhere. There are some specifics there that they were connected to this local organization, and they would open every week. I guess it was every Tuesday or 2 days a week, I'm not sure. And it became a kind of habit that people would go there even if they didn't have anything to repair. They would only for the conversations. And then I learned the importance of stories in repairing things and in creating these new possibilities. And another thing that I've learned there was the importance of the role of the valoriste. That is the person that works for the organizations involved with the circular economy scheme there. And the role of that person is to evaluate between an universe of objects, of stuff that show up either from waste recycling or for donations or from different organizations or from companies that donate auxiliary materials. And the role of this person is to understand what among those things can be reused in any ways, what among those things that are broken can be repaired, and what would be the effort and the cost, and who could be repairing those things. So this role, that in that place specifically, they have one person that is hired as a valorist, and it's related to, I don't know, those TV shows about people who go to buy things off auctions or buy secondhand things in order to resell them later. And I find this specific role in society particularly necessary. So I started to investigate that, and that brings me to the next step of my research. But maybe if anyone has comments, my chat, oh, sorry, the chat is not in the pad. So any comments, any?
So there was another question from Claire that was at the end of the previous section. So are smart cities all held within the worldview of GDP and consumption being God?
It depends on what you are understanding as smart cities there. So this concept of smart cities that is being ventilated by the industry, the IT industry, is all about GDP, consumption, markets. It's all about giving, in fact, less agency for local societies. And there are some dissonant voices that try to bring this critical perspective into the discussion about smart cities. There are some researchers, one of the researchers that I have mentioned earlier, he told me that he gave up this subject. He doesn't discuss smart cities anymore because he thinks it's useless to discuss with these people because their worldview is only about understanding technologies as ways to make money and to ensure that those in power will remain so. But there are people, and this publication, I don't remember exactly the name, I guess it was Rethinking the Smart City by Francesca Bria and Morozov, was trying to collect, in a sense, in one, I guess the first half is a kind of this critical perspective of the marketization that is embedded in everything that discusses smart cities. But in the second part, they were trying to bring up specific experiments that were trying to criticize and create alternatives. One of them is, there are many in the book, but there are, for instance, projects that try to regain control over water supply in cities, and they use technologies to help in that. There are projects that are creating autonomous energy infrastructures. There are projects that are they are counterbalancing the ways that, for instance, corporations like Uber and Airbnb have in generating data and owning data about traffic flows in the city, for instance, Uber. And they are trying to counterbalance that with legislation that makes sure that the data is shared with the city, so the city can also have access to that. So there are many critical alternatives being experimented with, but the main discourse, the main narrative about smart cities is still about, governments having control and corporations making money.
I believe Janet had a question or a comment about a project designed to link informal waste pickers in India with materials in the spirit of smart city.
Yeah, I'd like to see if you can share this project, Janet. I heard about some things that Data is working with. There's this Indian project that they are trying to set up 100 smart cities. and a number of them is just terrible. Some of them are trying to create new cities, as those kind of canonical examples of smart cities that were created about, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago. New Songdo City in Korea and Mazda City. But these are the kinds of projects that try to create new cities from nowhere, and they usually don't work. There's the other one in China that I don't remember exactly the name right now, but they are trying to mimic the way cities work in a kind of Disneyland scenario with lots of technologies embedded. But some of the smart cities projects in India are, in a very smart, very clever way, channeling the funds that are being driven by the Indian government and private sector to locally create interesting things. Yeah, I think there is a lot of nonsense, and the sad thing is that this kind of nonsense usually sells. They make money, and actually they get access to public money, set up this kind of thing.
Felipe, I had a quick question about the Nantes example you mentioned. You mentioned it's interesting ecosystem around repair. Was it just volunteer driven or connecting to professional repairers on the side?
Well, it is. They have a very complex ecosystem there, as things usually are in France. So there are 3 levels of government involved. So there are the local authorities, there is the regional and the state, and each of them has specific incentives. So in some cases is a tax cut for repair shops. In other cases is funding and grants being given to community organizations. But in specific case of Ping, this organization, they called it the Atelier Partagé de Vrai, the shared workshop of Vrai, that is this community. They would attract professional repairs people that would go once a week there, and some retired engineers, and then students. And it was very interesting to contrast, because the same organization was administering a fab lab in a kind of more higher scale region of Nantes, in the Isle, in the middle of the river, that is really close to the city center, close to the university, close to kind of more higher scale, higher income neighborhoods. And in that place, even though they tried to create a similar experience of an open workshop for people to bring their stuff in and get them repaired, that didn't work, because they didn't have the community ties of the other place, and it was seen as a kind of exclusive place that was not welcoming for people who were not used to the kind of vocabulary present in fab labs and architecture schools and all that. And I guess that's one important thing to notice. So the kind of community organization would attract a very diverse public, and the fab lab would attract product design and architecture and computer science students mostly.
Great, thank you. Should we move to the next section?
Yeah. Section. So, as part of my research, I decided to then try to investigate reuse, repair, and disposal of materials in the city. So I devised 2 different exercises that were meant to explore, particularly starting here in Dundee, what kinds of things people would do, and what could be seen as this kind of post-consumption field. So the first thing I did was to work with students here, master's degree students, to create this kind of decision flow mapping, what people decide to do with stuff that is not working, and in which cases they would try to repair themselves, they would take to professional repair, in which cases they would donate things, in which cases they would try to sell things. So I was just trying to map out the space. Can you move on, Hugo, please? We made this first attempt at understanding what kinds of organizations and what kinds of spaces were part of this kind of repair scenario. And what I did next was to open here. So I devised this study that was supposed to take place here in Dundee. I would give broken objects to people and ask them to spend 2 weeks in the city trying to get them repaired or repurposed or revalued in any sense. But because of COVID, we had to do it in our places. So I have recruited participants, and 7 persons took part in that experiment and spent a little over 2 weeks trying to get things repaired. And I guess that brought a lot of insights that I will explain in the next phase. So if you can move, I guess, 2 slides, please, Hugo. Just conscious of the time here. And then the other thing I'm doing, I made I did some interviews already, and now I'm going through my notes. Was an attempt to put this kind of overview of the space for reuse and repair in an ecosystem mapping. So the next slide, there are some of the organizations and actors that operate in this space. So from local authority, reuse schemes, to maker spaces, to hardware stores, charity shops. And I have interviewed some people, and the idea is that next I'll be trying to create a kind of, proposals based on an systemic view of what is to be done with secondhand materials, with broken objects, with things that people don't want anymore for any reason in cities. And then my plan is that in the second year of my research, my PhD research, I'll be experimenting and prototyping with solutions for that space. And the third year, we are supposed to advise, to create and advise on policies for those things to happen. So if anyone has questions before our last session. Mark, yes, you're right. Depending on the ecosystem boundary, I could add a lot more. This is what I took. This list, I just came up with this list today, but I still have to go through all my notes, and I know it's very, and it even depends on each city. So in some places and in some countries, there are very interesting repair markets. And there are some specific community projects that are not mentioned here, but this is exactly what I'm trying to explore. I'll be very happy to hear suggestions later on by email or other ways. Okay, thank you, Mark.
There is question. Well, the 10 is asking LA reuse. I think he means local authority reuse, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. There is a question from Janet. So she has a question about the commons. So in the UK, every last thing has an owner according to the law. Even fly tip waste is owned by local authorities. So how can we begin to think of a commons of post-consumer materials? What changes would be required at a system level?
Yeah, that is precisely one of the things that I've been trying to address in my research. And I'm feeding from interesting discussions about platform cooperativism. And but I'm really skeptical that there will be an easy way, particularly because of these specifics in each place things are treated differently. And this is one question that I made. If you see the first image of my presentation is a broken bike just beside a street waste bin. And one of the questions that I make, even in some posts in my blog, is how can you define who some object belongs if you see it in the streets? And I've been living in this flat I'm in right now for 11 months. And there's a bike outside that the neighbors say that they don't know who it belongs to. And it's been there for maybe a couple of years. And it's a a foldable bike that is getting rust because it's exposed to the weather. And now I'd like to see the possibility of creating a system that doesn't allow these things to happen, because it's a waste in this sense of potential users. But I don't see a shortcut to that. But maybe I guess I can address some of those questions in the next section.
There's a comment from Monique adding to the conversation about actors operating in the reuse and repair space. She's mentioning, what about museums and prop shops? That she's worked in both of these areas.
Yeah, I would like to know more about how museums could relate, but prop shops actually were totally off my radar. But then one of the persons that I have interviewed, out of chance, she buys, she hires props for video studios, for film studios, and then I was amazed to see this ecosystem. And prop shops are really an interesting case of circular economy in place. And I was happy to learn about it. But yeah, I don't know much about how museums come into that picture, but I'd be happy to hear more.
Then there's a question from Lorna. Is one of the key issues space to collate and redistribute, etc.? And
yes, and in some cities, for instance, in Barcelona, there is this habit of people putting things out to be collected the night before the collection goes. Things that they don't want anymore, things that are usually still functional, but they don't want anymore. And they just put it on the streets, and neighbors can go there and collect. And it's usually the same day every week in each neighborhood. And I missed that when moving to the UK last year and trying to set up my place. I would like to get access to discarded things. But then one of the things that emerged from the interviews I did with participants of the research study was that a good part of that role is now fulfilled by the likes of Gumtree or eBay or Facebook markets. And in some places, for instance, wet places like Scotland, it wouldn't be a good idea to just put things outside. But I got a bike.
One more question before we move to the next. Most of the actors, asks Panda, on your list are small in scale. Have you considered scale issues and whether you consider that solutions are small scale? And of course, the scale versus impact aspect.
In Nantes, they operate in different scales there. So one of them is organizations that receive donations from, for instance, how do you call it? Le Roi Merlin. It's like a big shop, a big store of house objects. I don't know, maybe akin to.
It's something like Homebase.
Yeah, I don't know. Not familiar with it. But then this organization made a partnership with this large store, and this store donates exceeding materials to this organization, and this organization has the intelligence to distribute these materials, and they are being paid by both by the government and by these organizations because they are solving a problem that these organizations have, and it's often, I guess most of the times, it's materials that have never been used. So it's in a way, it's a way to deal with excess and make sure that it doesn't end up in waste. But I think there is also a value for paying attention to small and local alternatives, because the possible impact that they have in localities is arguably bigger than if a large organization tries to deal with all of that, because they are not aware of the local issues. And there is also the other aspect of the impact of, the logistics of, for instance, getting everything to one place and then redistributing it. And I like to think of the potential for redistribution of value and redistribution of wealth that lie if we foster local alternatives for reuse and repair of things. Yeah, B&Q, yeah, this kind.
Okay. I see that it's almost 9. Should we move to the last section? Yeah.
So what I'm trying to do now with my research is to come up with design concepts. So we can these are very quick insights from the discussions that I had and from the research that I've done. One of them is that there are, at least coming from the practice of repair, there are at least 3 scales of value of objects. Some of them are low end, usually not worth repairing, and that's a problem, that they will possibly become waste or junk. Then there are the high end, expensive products that usually have maintenance schemes, and they usually have high upfront costs, and people tend to try to make sure that their lifetime is extended. But then there is a very extensive area in between, consumer brands that are not that easy to repair as the most expensive products, but people are not willing to part with these objects. And I guess that's pretty much a good part of what comes to repair cafes and to these kinds of things, to these kinds of organizations or events. And this is a kind of mapping of some of the insights that we had during these discussions. Can move to the next one, please, Hugo. Next, I'm trying also to come up with a kind of view of the process of repairing, so investigating the story of the object, clean the outside of the object, open it up, identify the problem, and then go through service manuals, prior experience, internet page, or even just play an experiment, even if you don't know exactly what is broken, and then repair and repurpose with many different ways. And then other 2 aspects that I'm trying to explore is the joys of repair that have to do it's not only a functional relationship. It's not only about making something become useful again the way it was useful before, but there are all sorts of learning experiences and cultural value and social value. And there is also this kind of, sticking to the man and being against the system. And there is the social and economic value of repair and reuse that is, it may be obvious, but is not taken into account when you talk about repair with the industry, with governments. And then the next slide, please, Hugo. And the other issue I'm trying to understand from my research is this relationship between repairing in a private space against repairing in city-funded or city-organized or community spaces, and how things operate, and when people decide to take something to repair in other places or by other people. So these are some of the issues and some of the questions that arise is, how to find about people, spaces, things, and parts in order to repair. Next slide is, if you think about the flow of materials in post-consumption, so this is an attempt to see, a city with lots of objects that could be reused, And the next slide is actually a copy of the last, the one that I've shown before. If you contrast these kinds of actors with the idea of understanding flows or commons of post-consumption, then I guess there is a lot of room to innovate. I am right now attending a course on platform cooperativism, and I think some of the issues that we see in the repair community, that I guess one of the main ones is the excessive fragmentation. So professional repairs people don't feel part of a trade because either they are very low, small scale, or they are very fragmented. They don't have neighbors who work in the same field. These issues could be addressed by a take related to platform cooperativism. I don't think I will go into trying to explain that right now, but yeah, I'll be happy if people want to know more once I'm finished with this section. But I think there is a lot of room to understand ways in which technology could help people who have similar interests and who have similar issues, who sometimes would benefit from cooperating either to buy equipment or to buy parts or to share equipment. There should be some possibilities that may be interesting there. And the next slide is some of the ideas that I'm starting to devise as open design concepts. So if you think that there may be, for instance, a bin in which you put things that can be repaired or can be evaluated for repair, or if you think, most in a very simple way of a transparent bin in which people can see what's inside, so people can understand not only the amount of things that go to waste, but also the kind of things that go to waste. This could help facing the problem that waste management is usually about making things disappear, even if they are valuable. I think there is the possibility of locally or government-funded community repair facilities, and that has a lot to do with education, but also of generating income for people in need and addressing social inequalities. And there is a third scale that is more in the sense of creating technologies. So setting up online databases of objects, their parts, the instruments needed to assess their state, or the equipment and tools needed to repair them. And together with this online database, create ways, for instance, CV here is computer vision, so a kind of equipment with a camera that would help people assess the potential value of objects, or even an app that people can point to objects they see in the streets and understand what is the potential value of them. And for that, this is where I'm trying to understand the possibility of platform cooperativism in a multi-stakeholder approach that would not only, because in Brazil we have lots of cooperatives of waste pickers, people who go in the streets and collect recyclable materials, and then they sell these materials to recycling plants. But these co-ops are usually only making this work of collecting things and sending them to the industry. And there is very little thought into reusing and upcycling those objects. And there is no experiment that I know trying to make citizens also part of these cooperative efforts. So not only a cooperative of waste pickers, but also cooperative of people who want to have their second-hand goods managed collectively by this body. This is very tentative. These ideas, in the sense, is still very speculative. But this is, I guess, where my research is moving to. I guess I should stop there. I just inserted another 3 slides that were a tale, but I'll leave that for later. Maybe open now for discussions.
Thanks, Felipe. Sad unicorn, yes. Is there any question? I see one has been typed right now.
Arthur, yeah.
Okay, so one question, how do we avoid that some of your solutions, especially those based in tech, don't end up falling into some of the same traps of the tech solutionism of the smart city?
Yeah, to tell you the truth, I'm not that much interested in the tech solutions. I think they would be a way to show the value of the underlying architecture that I think is more on my focus. This kind of commons-based approach to manage discarded materials or things that people don't want anymore, and everything that ends up in the recycle bin behind charity shops now in the UK that could benefit from skills and labor to to be reused in society. So if I need to develop a technological solution in the NAP or something like that to give visibility to that, I would go in that direction. But what I'm most concerned with is this kind of governance and legal architecture that allows people to cooperate with material goods in spaces that are not only regulated by offer, by demand, by market-driven mechanisms. I think there is a lot of space for solidarity and cooperation. And from my own experience in Brazil, people are usually eager to cooperate with their neighbors if the system allows. But yeah, there's this issue of property and ownership. And I guess in the Platcorp movement, there are some very innovative solutions being created to address issues of ownership on an organizational level. And I think it arguably could be extended to ownership of physical goods. But yeah, I'm not there yet.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Arthur. He says, I believe that litter picker was made an official employment status in Brazil, which helped to give more recognition and opportunities for this sector. How did that happen?
It was a very strong movement by social organizations. We have the MNCR, the National Movement of the Waste Pickers. But there is also this sense of opportunity by the industry, because the industry doesn't have to spend as much money as they would spend if they were in charge of collecting. So it's okay for them to hire local co-ops. And what happens is these local co-ops are usually underfunded because they cannot make a living out of the materials they collect. So there is all sorts of social issues and mental health issues and precariousness, work precariousness coming from that. They usually don't have access to protective equipment. So there are lots of issues involved with that. In some cases, they have the cooperatives, they sum up and then they manage to get funding, for instance, to get a truck or things like that. But it's usually very very precarious, their work, even though they are recognized. But their recognition was just, it was good for them to get registered. So now you can register as a sole micro entrepreneur in Brazil and have access to some job security, access, for instance, to health insurance. Everybody has access to Brazil, and it's awful for everyone. But they have access to unemployment benefit for 3 months and for maternity leave for, I guess, 4 months. But that was the only change. In the rest, the industry is still benefiting. I guess in Brazil we collect more. We recycle maybe, 90% of aluminum from cans, but the biggest beneficiaries are still, members of the industry, not the collectors themselves.
And there's a comment from Marina in Buenos Aires saying we have exactly the same situation in Argentina, quite controversial and complex.
Yeah, in the flat cork space, there is one initiative in Brazil called Cataqui. It was created by a street artist. He led the movement to try to make sure people understood the value of the work of the waste pickers, and he started just painting their how do you call it? Carroças, the carts they bring, they use in the city to collect things. And but then I guess he did this crowdfunded project to develop an app that helps people find waste pickers that then collect things from their spaces instead of just throwing them in the bin. So it was a kind of small scale, interesting solution. But yeah, there is this whole, I guess, deeper discussion about the quality of the work of waste pickers that should be taken into account also.
Great. Well, I guess my last question is, how can we help and or contribute as a community to this ongoing work that you're doing?
I think I have had some help already in announcing and making the call the open call for participation that I made. I had some people coming from the Restart community, and I will be progressing towards creating these co-design concepts. So, ideas based on the research data that I've collected so far. And I would be happy to reach out to the community to validate and hear more and, get feedback about that. I just need to, as I'm doing this as a PhD research, I now need to create another layer of ethics approval so as to make sure that any feedback I get, I can use in the research later on.
Great.
Can you just move to the last slide?
Yeah.
Just my contact. Not that one. This story about the unicorn is in my blog. So if you want to check what happened with the unicorn, it's all there. So this is the link to my blog, and this is my current email. And thanks for the opportunity to talk. And I know we have exceeded the time for the session, but if anyone wants to talk, I'm here.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Felipe. I think, we had a really great session and plenty to read up. We'll try to capture we've captured all the documents and movies, thanks Dan, that have been mentioned so that we can all follow up. Before saying goodnight, I'd just like to remind everyone that Fixfest continues this Saturday at 11 with a session on fixing sewing machines, maintenance and repair from 11 to 12:30. And if you'd like advice fixing your sewing machine in the session, please send photos of the problem to fixfest@therestartproject.org, and Jenny can try to help. And also, one other announcement: next week on Thursday, we'll have a lightning talks, demos, and show and tell session hosted by Dave Green. If you have something small and beautiful to share with the UK community, there are still slots available, so please get in touch. You'll have 5-minute slots to share with everyone else what you're working on or what you like to share. Thanks again. We'll be back on Saturday, and thanks one more time to for support from Nest and DCMS for running the whole series of Fixfest, and thanks for everyone who helped making it happen in the background. And thanks, Felipe, for your very insightful presentation. Good night, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.